Hey, hon, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. What you been thinking about?
Oh, enjoyed our conversation on limits, for Ojibo's conversation, and I guess I was just thinking about um how that relates to the limit of the body itself.
Hmm.
Like I was thinking about how the words mediation and medication are so similar and sound so similar. And though obviously there's a role for medications, but there can be a way in which um, they can sometimes be a bit more parallel to like the technological essence, which has a promise of basically mediating and problem solving and basically being the answer, if you will. And in a way, it presents itself as unlimited help, right? Um, unlimited in that sense, but you are limited to, again, the mediation of that medication or something like that. I just think the words are interesting too, because it's like mediation requires, I do believe it requires philosophy, it requires attention, it requires slowing down. Um, the word also sounds like it's close to meditation, right? As well. So anyway, there's some interesting wordplay with that, but I guess I was thinking about how um, yeah, the technological essence almost seems to want to transcend some of our human limitations. And that can be for good, but it can also be for bad when we do not acknowledge the limitations that are inherent in our body that are actually meant for our personal transcendence, if you will, like in the sense of like Nietzschean, the Übermensch, or something like that. Like there's kind of a Superman that the human actually has the capacity for in being a limited subject, right? Like our subjectivity is limited and unlimited because the psychological scape is, how do you quantify that, right? Like, is it, how it seems to have this sort of metaphysical space in our head, right? That like blends into the unconscious and the conscious and past and present and future. And we hold it all with this limit of our body, but the limit is also that which allows us to do things that are, in a sense, unlimited, or unlimited in the sense that it's the avenue for, like we were talking about in our conversation. Um, it's like the saturation, like in the Ebert language, right? The saturation, then it's almost like it leads to the next, like it births the next thing. And um, yeah, I guess I just was thinking about all of that because the very practical bearings, I think, on our modern society is that we aren't sure, like you're saying, we were talking about this a little bit, but like people don't know what like limits they should have or they should accept about themselves and whatnot. And again, if the technological essence offers a solution, then why would you ever like, that it almost seems like rational to do that, but that there seems to be this non-rational space of relating to ourselves and our bodies that's important actually for our like full capacity and our full humanness. Um, because yeah, otherwise you just think about it in terms of like, oh, that limit is a brokenness, when really that limit is an opening for emergence, like we were talking about as well. So anyway, that's kind of what I was thinking about, Daniel. But now I'll throw it
Yeah.
back your way.
Yeah. Well, no, the topic of limits, I mean, in a very real way, what, we have the social coordination mechanism is being paralleled with, it's kind of being matched with Hayek's pricing mechanism. So we're calling it a mechanism kind of to allude to its relation to Hayek's thinking. And you could say that what the pricing mechanism is to, I want to say the commodity, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. And, the market consists of more than commodities, but the commodity is kind of a catch term for the operations of the quantifiable operations of the market in some degree. Or you could say what the pricing mechanism is to capital, however you want to put it. But I'm going to just say commodity here. What commodities are to the pricing mechanism, limits are to the social coordination mechanism, and that the SCM is coordinating, testing, and experimenting with limits. Because in the same way, so we have a problem here. In the same way, like Dietrich Maclowski and many of the Austrians and Hayek and others will talk about, we don't know what is valuable ahead of time. Like we don't know what hammer is best. Like an entrepreneur has to come up with their model of a hammer, another entrepreneur comes up with theirs, and then they put it on the market. They're tested, And maybe this hammer is better for $10, but this other hammer is better for heavy duty things for $30. And there's a kind of contingency there. But what is best is relative to, the context and what you're after and stuff like that, right? And so you have to test. And so for Dietrich McCloskey, because we simply don't know what is most valuable, if we use that term here, for when and how, you have to constantly test. And she really wants to stress, as many of the brilliant Austrian thinkers will, that the market, far from it's about making money or making profit, it's about this problem of coordination. Like the capitalism is at its heart supposed to be, now, of course, you can say this is idealistic, but at least for Hayek as the pricing mechanism, it is dealing with the coordination problem of von Mises, and then you could say the knowledge problem of Friedrich Hayek. And so you're always doing that coordination. And there's everyone from Thomas Sowell to Hayek to Luhmann. There are many thinkers who could help you kind of think through this. And so you have this coordination problem. And the coordination problem is so you could really see it as kind of a knockout punch to command economies. And I think many do. Now, of course, the China model, maybe with AI could overcome the coordination problem. And that's what many people are debating. But that debate aside, the argument we want to make is that you actually need something similar. What you need for commodity, you actually need for limit as well. You need a mechanism of constantly testing, trying out different combinations, proportions of this, that, of the hammer, this, that, and so forth. As you do for commodity, you actually need to do for limits, because it is not self-evident and nobody knows ahead of time what limits can be overcome by technology and the trade-offs be worth it. What limits shouldn't be overcome by technology, because if you do it, it unleashes psychological hell upon us, if you will, because when you remove limits, you increase freedom. And when you increase freedom, that can psychologically overwhelm people. And maybe some people think the CRISPR gene editing technology, genes are limits you can overcome without destroying us. Well, while other people say, I don't know about that, that risk may be too much. And some people may do CRISPR and others may not. And then you run the experiment to see who's better off or not. Now, of course, if your neighbor is using CRISPR, this is what we learned from the sociologists. If your neighbor's using gene editing technology to give their kids a super high IQ and you're not, you could feel ethically terrible and such. So there will be a pressure to do it. And that's the problem. There's always this pressure to follow technology. But there's also something entrepreneurial about it, because you can just say, well, looking at the risk assessment, sure, I can see that kid will have 180 IQ, but I think they're going to be destroyed by various unintentional consequences that would come from that, perhaps. So you don't take that, but everyone would have to do their various, dare I say, experiments and so on and so forth. Now, there's a lot more to be said about that, but basically, the pricing mechanism almost has to assume, it basically assumes in its very essence that all limits should be overcome. Like that all limits, like technology, the working assumption of technology is that limits should be overcome. And that gives you progress. I mean, that gives you air conditioning. That gives you all of many of the great accomplishments of human beings. But it's very, very difficult for the market and the pricing mechanism to treat limits as that which should be honored, because there's always an incentive to overcome them. And it's really, that's a value. Like if I say, no, there are some limits that humans need, prove it. Based on what? How do you make that decision, right? It's a non-rational metaphysical claim, right? And please note, all of our talk about limits is going to be strongly tied to, it's going to be, Alex Ebert does such great work on that topic, and his work on freak theory is really outstanding. But without going into it, basically what we'll argue in Belonging Again is that the value form that capital is habituated to is ultimately fungibility, kind of the equal sign, $20 equals a shovel, or things are exchangeable, the abstract social use. And these are Marxist categories, and they have some problems with them, but there's the commodity form has a certain exchangeability to it, that things can be exchanged, but that in of itself means there aren't limits. There's just exchanging. There's just difference that can be exchanged, but it's not really a limit. Limits can be overcome. And furthermore, the entrepreneurial incentives are to, well, figure out how to fly, figure out how to do something that seems impossible, because there's a lot of value for overcoming it. So I don't want to say that people in capitalism can't think like Ivan Illich and that there are limits that we need, but it is not the habituation of the pricing mechanism. It's not the habituation of technology. The entire kind of thrust of the technological essence is basically to overcome limit. Well, overcoming limit increases productivity. It increases GDP. But then we learn in psychoanalysis, or I think, many thinkers of the modern counter-enlightenment, they understand that without limits, humans are destroyed. We're overwhelmed by ourselves. Our psyche requires limitation. We require tension, as Cadell talks about in Systems and Subjects. If there's no tensions, we don't develop. If there are no limits, we don't develop. And yet, the very essence of the pricing mechanism is to overcome limits. And therefore, if it succeeded, it would kind of remove the limits we need to develop. Like if it actually made life more, like a clear example is capitalism has an incentive to make your life easier, because you're going to pay, people pay for making their life easier. But if it actually succeeds at that, it removes all of the challenges we need to develop. Well, that creates a real tension, right? So what ends up happening is you have a problem where capitalism is naturally toward overcoming limits. But if it succeeds, then there's something about the human being that does not develop. But here's the other trick, and this is where perhaps some of the more Marxist side or the sociology sides are warning, and I'll throw it to you on any thoughts, but there's way more to say, is that as you are in capital, it also trains your habits. And that's almost a James K. Smith point as well, it trains your habits. So then you actually get trained to assume limits are supposed to be overcome, and that becomes like the technological essence. You kind of get trained into a habit of assuming limits should be overcome. So the pricing mechanism naturally does it, and then you get trained into thinking that way, thus assuming more technology is good. That's kind of the technological essence. We make our tools and our tools make us. So then we also are trained to experience the world like the market, which is to overcome limits. And so we come to assume that we need to overcome limits when we actually need limits. So then we need an alternative infrastructure. Because here's the other thing, you can't just let me put it this way. It's very difficult to think a thought that goes against the habituation of your environment, aesthetic, and system. Like if your system is training you to assume limits should be overcome, how in the world do you think the thought that you shouldn't, assume that, right? Well, maybe you happen to have an elder. Maybe church taught you that. Maybe you happen to have family members. There's a kind of randomness to it. And even if there are a few individuals here and there that get that non-rational point, the likelihood that it will have collective sway, certainly before a grassroots movement of a kind, is very, very low. And so it's kind of like you'll have individuals who are quote unquote Nietzschean children, as we've talked about, but not really a collective of that, because that's when you're going to need an infrastructure, a alternative way to be habituated. And basically the argument is that the social coordination mechanism can train you into the thoughts of needing limits and discerning limits that you need, and not just assuming that limits should be overcome, that the pricing mechanism by itself is not so good at habituating you into thinking. So what you need is the social coordination mechanism with the pricing mechanism, because when you have them both together, you can have the effective coordination and testing of commodity and the effective coordination and testing of limits. And you need both. If there are no limits, then I would argue the system actually stagnates. Humans lose creativity, they don't develop. And then it's a larger argument. I would actually argue the system ceases to create demand, only stimulate demand, as Keynes warned about, that leads to stagnation. And I think you run the risk of growth being concentrated. You get zero-sum growth, non-zero-sum growth. So you need limits, but here's the issue. Who decides which limits? Is it top down? Oh, I think you shouldn't use air conditioning because you're better. Well, I'm the oppressor, and so I outlaw air conditioning to everyone, right? Well, that's very problematic. So then who decides what limits that people need and what limits don't? Well, that's begging tyranny, right? And so you can't have the limits be decided. They have to be something that there's enough flow, testing, and coordination in the system for people to try different, try different proportions according to different value forms to see what works for them and to basically run the test for individuals. Now, then, of course, the question becomes, what are you testing for? What is the quality that's being tested? And then that gets into things like beauty. I think the ability to handle the shock, the surprise of difference between people, to handle the real, all of that. social tensions. But really, what has to occur, the social coordination mechanism is necessary so that people can even think the thought that limit is needed, that there are other value forms, that there are other ways of valuing things, that there's actually a good in, say, not overcoming a limit. And like, so the idea that the body could be a limit, an actual limit versus a contingent limit, or a limit that you accept, and that it would be good to do that. I agree with you. But there are some people that would disagree, and then you would need to have a market of, a marketplace of, people talk about a marketplace of ideas. You almost want to say a marketplace of limits and different proportions of limits to see who develops and who doesn't develop accordingly. And then also to find others of whom, say, perhaps agree with that or want to kind of run the thought with it, but you have to form those communities. Now, there's a lot more to be said, but basically, there's something about the social coordinate, and you also need to make a distinction between actual limits, contingent limits, and excess limits, which I think is very, very important. But again, I guess just the starting point is that what the commodity was for the pricing mechanism, limits are to the social coordination mechanism. And without limits, we perish. But then with the wrong kind of limits, we also perish. So what do? There needs to be a better coordination and testing of those limits. But I'll throw it to you for any thoughts on anything at all.
I guess the question that was coming to my mind was, doesn't it get a little tricky though? Because if people do have different things they accept as limits or what ought to be limits or something like that, that also affects people's discernment or how they interpret what the result of the limits are. So I guess what I mean to say is like because somebody might be hearing you and be like, okay, that's all good and well, like, so marketplace of limits, okay. But how do we like decide that X limits are doing X thing versus Y limits doing Y thing, and which is better, I mean, that's, again, I think you already touched on it, like in the sense that like this is where beauty comes in. This is where it's a little bit of like, the pragmatism a bit here can come in here a little bit, like what's just functioning, like what's actually like in a sense, like evolutionarily, like what's surviving, what's not, what's surviving in such a way that is thriving, and what's not. And I don't, you can still decide in your own framework that like I don't know, somebody could say well, I just don't believe that, right? Or I don't want that type of thriving. But it's almost like, I don't know, there's something that's so profoundly simple, like everybody mostly knows how to receive a smile versus like a middle finger or something like that, like, or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like there's just these little gestures and body language, back to the body, but like there's something that's very, I mean, yes, we can make it, it is complex, but it's also kind of like something that's like there's a childlikeness there's a simplicity in discernment of what are the results, right? What's the outcome? What are the test results? You know what I'm saying? And I think that, but I understand that, people would say, well, it's easy with a smile or like a middle finger, but like if it's something where it's about the quality of life and assessing that, then that can be different. Again, I can say, sure, agreed. However, there's still going to, it maybe have to just, this is why actually determining people's wants, like we talk about, desire to drive and all that, like there's something about, want, which is actually related to limit, that is important. And I don't know that people, like understanding what do you actually want might be important to then being able to discern, again, the results, or right, like how is this testing going? But it is a question, right? Because again, if people are going to have these different, like a marketplace of limits, could those limits then affect people's the univocity of their like agreement about what the limits result in? And again, that's where I kind of go back to like, well, honestly, what just over time, like what do you get over time? Like what sort of sticks around? Now, the tricky thing is that technological essence is going to be like, well, I'll be here forever because I'm the technological essence, I'm not going to deteriorate like a flower or whatever. So, that's where it's kind of tricky. But I don't think that, this could also be kind of transhumanist, et cetera. But I don't think that necessarily just there's something about standing the test of time, but in what way, right? Like, is it through like the changing of the human in the sense that they actually grow and cultivate their self in their inner subjectivity, et cetera? Or are we just talking about like getting something to last really long, but fixing it, that I don't think that's really, I mean, but again, some people might say, yeah, that's it. That's why people, there are people who really offer transhumanism, et cetera. But yeah, there's something about this kind of, if we're thinking about the human project as human in that type of limitation, then there's this other idea of like, well, the results will be whatever, yeah, again, kind of sticks around. But I think there is like qualitative assessment, and I do wonder if like we get skewed in our ability to assess quality because maybe we just never been able to experience, or maybe we're so guarded against experiencing it because that would be hard. You actually have to like let go of relinquish, like we've talked about before. You have to do a radical relinquishing to receive, actually. And that can be hard on the ego, actually, to do such a thing. So there's a lot there, but the really the distilled question is this market of limits could affect people's, therefore affect the discernment of limits to say which is better, or if you can use that term. So what do you say about that?
Well,
Thanks,
the short answer is what is being selected for is what configuration or portfolio, or however we want to put it, what type of limits are best for surviving global interconnectivity to keep you from going crazy or losing all your energy or being overwhelmed. Because that's ultimately because fittedness is tied to environment. Like if you're talking in evolution, there's something very evolutionary about what we're discussing here, right? So the question is, what is the environment now that is being selected for? Well, the environment is global pluralism. Okay, internet, high-level interconnectivity, everything is connected. What does that mean? What does interconnectivity mean? Well, it means there's in a sense a collective consciousness. And a lot of people can say, oh, that's magic, Noonspear, and there's something Noonspear Chardane about this. But also that if there's a collective consciousness, that means collective subconsciousness, collective energy, and that means you're risking madness. Lovecraft, people being overwhelmed, a certain kind of chaos coming upon everything. And, Cadell, in his book on global singularity, I mean, there are many thinkers who are pointing in this direction, that there's something about interconnectivity that leads to an environment that can, be extremely psychologically demanding on people. And how they respond to that can be, well, a lot of it is responses of limits. People become hikikomori, they isolate, or they go back to the Amish, or they Dugan. All of these are limits. And it should be noted, so a lot of what we are discussing about limits could be associated with what is being called now post-liberalism. And I suppose there's that gentleman, Philip Hillington, who has a book on it. But there are many, like post-liberal, and you could say Dugan's a post-liberal. And like a lot of what those people are basically saying is that liberalism, the Washington Consensus, capitalism, markets, democracy, that combination, I suppose Yarvin, that there's something about that leads to a flattening of society. It leads to people being unhappy. You could even say economically it doesn't work because people cease caring and being dynamic. You could say it would seem as if liberalism might lead to, low desire society, as some people are calling Japan. Japan may be a really strong case study of where liberalism leads, especially once liberalism removes religion. And there are many also post-liberal thinkers who will argue that what has happened in the West has always been actually not pure liberalism, but a liberalism that's smuggled in. I think Philip will bring this in, like that is smuggled in non-liberal attributes such as religion and things. And Philip will really emphasize that what liberalism wants to destroy is all arbitrary hierarchy. It's anti-hierarchy. And maybe even you could associate that with Peterson, Pajot talking about the role of hierarchy. And you see, we just don't, the only hierarchy is allowed is the one where you climb the ladder at work, and that's not considered arbitrary. That's considered a legitimate meritocracy. But then there's something about liberalism where meritocracy doesn't actually apply. There's more genetics and other things. So it loses its credibility and starts falling apart. But the point is, there's something about post-liberalism that is saying we need limits of some kind. We need hierarchy, we need order, or humans go crazy. They don't get belonging, they don't have roots, and there's a lot of problems. But then the issue is a lot of the post-liberal stuff is basically rejoining a religion, going back to church, or going back to something traditional. So, and the problem with that is even if that could be good for individuals or have its role, there's something about that which is the old address. It's returning, it's trying to go back to givens in an old way versus a sublation. So we need some sort of sublation, to use that Hegelian term. We need belonging again in a new way. We need limits again in a new way that are not trying. Here's the question: how do you get limits without shielding yourself from global pluralism? Because basically a lot of a lot of the post-liberalism is like, well, the way we're going to deal with the overwhelm of interconnectivity and all the planets being connected together is basically by pulling out, like moving away or going back to something that can root us. Or you see, what's interesting too is the post-liberal has a sort of critique of capitalism flattening out difference. So there's this weird thing where you can have a simultaneous like flattening out of the subject while simultaneously exposing the subject to interconnectivity that psychologically overwhelms them. In the argument, there's like a few moves you could make potentially. You could say, well, if people had stronger traditions, they would actually be more able to handle the psychological overwhelm. Or you can say, well, just remove people from the psychological overwhelm, but that tends to kind of correspond with going back to some sort of community that has strong tradition. There's a lot of different configurations, but the point is you need limit. You need some kind of limit, or this is what I am arguing, and then I'll throw it to you. You need some kind of limit to not be overwhelmed by global interconnectivity. Exposure to the other, global pluralism is not when you know that Hinduism exists, it's when you're a Christian and your neighbor is a Hindu. Like that can psychologically overwhelm you. And right now the argument would be the environment as an interconnected world is going to select almost evolutionarily for who can survive that difficulty, who can survive that unleashed collective consciousness and the energy demand, right? So what are the qualities then you would be looking for with your individual investment strategy, portfolio of limits you're going to give yourself over to, and which limits you're going to try to overcome with technology and so on, so on. So various qualities. You don't have any energy. You feel overwhelmed all the time, right? You're paralyzed, right? Okay. Well, then that may not be a good investment strategy for limits. Number two, there's some individual or political figure or celebrity that is infallible to you. Like everything they say, you listen to, you never critique them, they become a big other, because now you're looking for a neurotic, right? That would be very problematic. This would not be a good strategy because you're in a certain kind of disavow, right? Three, you treat all difference as fungible, or you're basically dealing with difference by avoidance. Like you're avoiding it, right? Like you're shielding yourself from it, right? I think four, you're angry. Well, there's something about the global interconnectivity creates a whole lot of anger, like a whole lot of rage. Like there's a lot of rage. Like look at all these boomers watching the news all day. And I hate to use boomers in a negative way, but there's a lot of older people watching the news constantly who are constantly angry, like just constantly angry. This would not be good. This is wasted energy, right? So I'm going to start by saying energy, motivation tends to be indications of a bad investment strategy, because let's say like if the pricing mechanism in a certain way is coordinating commodity and the various profit would be an indication of successful coordination, not necessarily if the market has been manipulated by state intervention, or so the Austrian would argue, but there's some sort of increase in access to wealth. McCloskey may say wealth, but wealth would include air conditioning. Even if you're, say, poor, but you have air conditioning, you're wealthier than people in the past who did not have air conditioning. So the quality that would indicate successful price coordination would be wealth, quote unquote. There's something about successful social coordination that is energy, or a certain sort of energetic way of carrying yourself in the world where you're not overwhelmed all the time. So there's some sort of energetic dimension, some ability to flow, things like that. Now I'm going to pause, but those would be opening claims. And what we're trying, like the social coordination mechanism wants to acknowledge the critiques of post-liberalism, but also suggest that throwing out liberalism is not the answer. What is needed is a sublation of liberalism, but that cannot be done without the social coordination mechanism working in concert with the pricing mechanism. How and why and so on exactly gets into the belonging again, but let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, that was all very good, Daniel. And energy is a great way. I think you're right. I guess I'm just thinking about how, like, we talk about self-deception sometimes, and it's so easy to do that, right? Where we're not really paying attention to our energies and all of that. Or we say, well, yeah, I have no energy and I like, it's hard to like, I'm anxious, or whatever, I'm stressed, but there's nothing I could like, there's almost this belief that there's nothing one can do about it. When sometimes there is a lot one can do about it. Sometimes not as much, but there's always something. I do believe there's always something that a person can do. Now, that might be a belief in some access to an unlimited that maybe somebody decides they don't have or they don't want to have. But yeah, I guess I'm just interested in that because um, I guess what I mean to say is somebody could acknowledge that about themselves, but then not, yeah, it's like this kind of well, one temptation could just be to blame everybody else, right? If everyone else was just do what I want them to do or what I'm doing, then I wouldn't be so stressed, right? And there is a temptation, a human temptation, absolutely, that everyone can struggle with, but you really do have to fight that because first of all, how was that working out for you? And then second of all, um, you're giving away all your agency, all your power, right? And that would be like sliding into a kind of victimhood mindset. And so, yeah, all in all, I mean, thing is too, if you've got low energy though, you're probably less able to be productive in the ways you want to be. So again, this is where like there are real results, right? There's real results in how and what you're able to accomplish if you have low energy versus a higher energy. And that's why I thought it's so interesting. Like we were talking about the other day about like there is something about, with Gurdjieff's work and stuff where spirit and energy were so associated theologically and in the past and historically. And so there is something about this, like we talk about that with mysterious motivation and like mysterious energy, how much it does relate to how's the condition of your spirit, right? How's the condition of your heart, your mind, what you're ruminating about, what you keep like blaming others about or keep holding against other people. Like those things can really show up in your energy because they're a condition of your spirit. So yeah.
There's a question of if we talk about what is being selected for in the environment of interconnectivity, then the suggestion would be, in a certain sense, for portfolios, quote unquote, portfolio of limits that are best invested to handle the challenges of interconnectivity, the psychological demands, the energetic demands, the tearing with negativity, encountering otherness, difference, and so on and so forth. And then, yes, there's always the risk of self-deception, therefore the need for constant testing, right? Constant testing. But then the question is, how do you engage in the test? So it would seem as if you engage in the test by engaging in interconnectivity, right? And maybe you say, well, I actually believe isolation. I believe, maybe you say, I actually think interconnectivity, all possible strategies of tearing with interconnectivity are doomed. And you say, what I'm going to do is be very, very isolationist. Let's just say Amish. And the question would be, well, what would be the indication that that was the winning strategy? Because maybe it is. Maybe interconnectivity, nobody knows. This is why you need constant testing. Nobody knows ahead of time. Nobody knows what's the best hammer ahead of time. What's the best technology ahead of time until it's invented, tested, distributed to a sufficient amount to give us a reasonable signal on the good or value of the technology, blah, 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 right? You have to do that. And we haven't really had a way to sufficiently test different portfolios, I'll just say today, of limits, because we haven't even had a means to help people train their ability to think according to different value forms. They've been stuck mostly thinking in terms of pragmatism or the commodity form according to capital. So the ability to think, say, more creatively or to value limits or here and there, or to even question technology in the Ivan Illich sense, all of this would require different habituation, which would need a different social infrastructure to even do. So we're not even in a place to run. There's a sense in which we don't even have the conditions of possibility by which to meaningfully run the experiment of different kinds of limit portfolios to see which are best fitted to handle interconnectivity, global interconnectivity, and the energy that demands on the subject, right? And maybe completely going outside of interconnectivity is the best way. Well, how would you determine you would win? Well, I mean, in evolutionary terms, there's something about reproduction, birth rates, who's having babies and who is not, right? And if the ones and there is something, and Jim Rudd has talked about this and other people, that communities that have less exposure to the outside, that are more limited in global exposure, and they make examples of the Amish who are not totally anti-technology. They're just aware of what technology makes it easier to encounter otherness, and they are very aware of that. They tend to have higher birth rates, right? And the more, generally speaking, the more exposed people are to interconnectivity, to pluralism, the birth rates fall, seemingly. Right now, I'm no expert on that topic, but there's evidence to suggest that is the case. Well, that would be pretty good evidence that maybe the investment strategy of staying out of interconnectivity is the best, right? But maybe there are other worldviews or portfolios of limits that actually are able to maintain high birth rates in the midst of global pluralism, right? We don't know. We have to run that experiment, because then the other thing, like, I'm just focusing on birth rates here for a moment, because that's obviously a hot topic with many people, and it's debated if it's even a problem, and other people don't, blah, blah, blah. But all of that aside, birth rates would be a fairly good indicator of the value of a limit portfolio, right? Because here's the reason why I say that. There might be a connection between energy and reproduction. When people feel energetically overwhelmed, they don't have children. Right? Or if they're energetically overwhelmed and they're not able to handle otherness, then when they go on dates, they're overwhelmed by otherness and they don't get married and they isolate or stuff, right? So the dating world can collapse in global interconnectivity because the energy demands. The energy demands of a highly technological society may make having children difficult. And of course, people would say, well, they're also not having children because the job market is bad and people can't make money. But then, of course, there's counter evidence that shows there are many poor people who quote unquote poor people who have lots of children. So it's not exactly clear. It could just be a culture issue, right? Well, we don't really know, because the conditions of possibility are not there to run the experiment well, because you don't have a means by which to test and experiment with different cultures. And you can look at, well, you could argue there's something about cultures that are portfolios of limits. Yeah, let me throw it to you.
Well, you said that, how that we don't have the conditions of possibility to test.
Yes. I don't mean entirely. I mean, we're starting it with the spread of the social coordination mechanism and things like that.
Right. Because I mean, in a sense, it's always kind of being tested anyway, right? I mean,
Sure.
if we think even like, just again, not to reduce it to this,
the intensity has skyrocketed. As globalization has become faster and more intense, the test, and you could argue globalization has been going on since Columbus, but now it defines the everyday person. So the test has strongly gained in intensity. Please.
Yeah, well, there's also something about like the test, the conditions are developing already, but our capacity to witness them and see them for what they are is important, because then we don't know what to look for, right? Like I was saying, like it's so true. Like unless you've grown watermelons, you won't know this, but you really have to, like, there are signs to know when the watermelon is ripe, and if you pick it too soon, it's not going to ripen anymore. So it's a big deal. Like it's a big deal to know when that fruit that is ripe, to know when it's ripe. And so that's why this question I was going back to of like, well, how do we cultivate a way of discerning if everybody's going to pick like different limits, and then that might impact their ability to discern or how they define things, etc. Which again, that's kind of part of it. That's the necessary difference for the sake of the testing. But I guess what I wanted to say is that the conditions for the testing, it's a unique time because the internet shields a lot of people from. So today we're at an interesting time because we've got the internet sort of presenting all the difference, but also shielding us from that difference in terms of actual context. Psychologically, there's psychologically we're encountering the difference, but physically we're not always. Now you have the good example of like, it's not just the abstract concept of somebody having a different religion, it's somebody in your neighborhood or like your community or whatever it is. So yeah, it's physical too, of course, but like there's this interesting, the internet structure is almost like to see, like it's almost like the medium is a type of suspension of judgment, all while you also could be as it does this both in, perhaps that was more collapsed because when people encountered difference, they had a fight. You know what I mean? Like it was like difference either led to harmonization or it was a fight and somebody won. You know what I mean? It's just, whereas like, or like I said, there was a harmonization or like Silk Roads or like things like that, right? Where people would collaborate and like there's this kind of like cross-cultural type of stuff. So what I mean to say is that like it does seem like we're in a unique time for conditions. And yes, there are, in a sense, already at play, but perhaps what's not, it's becoming realized and we're becoming more aware of, is that these conditions exist, one, and that they can be used in this really beneficial way to be able to see what, what comes forth from that, what comes forth from what each person chooses as limits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think there's probably maybe a little bit more to get into, because in a sense, this has always been the case, right? You'll see what happens with the tree when time, right? What is it going to have? What's it going to result in? But yeah, we have this unique, interesting time and medium that we're dealing with, which gives, again, both an encounter with difference and not an encounter of difference, and a psychological space that's being cultivated in new ways. And then the capacity to have the potential to witness otherness, and then maybe decide, or yeah, not maybe, definitely decide, if you understand that it is actually a sort of choice, if you will, to see what is most aligned with yeah, beauty, truth, goodness, a life you want to actually live, the energy you actually want to have, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, a community you actually want to have. So yeah, I'll send it back to you.
Well, globalization has been arguably going on for a very long time, but there has not been a effective means of testing different portfolios of limits to see the different energetic responses to exposure to global interconnectivity, and what can best handle it, what cannot, et cetera, so forth. And look, there's a lot of people, you could say that for most of history, globalization was experienced by people invested in the limits more defined by the economics, tradesmen on the Silk Road. So they were limited by the trade, the salt. I can't fight. I need your salt. You need my pepper or whatever. We're limited by that, and that actually allows there to be shared intelligibility, right? And so, like, but could we interact limited by the excess limit of beauty? And the other thing kind of hovering over this conversation is I think the social coordination mechanism helps test limits to tell which limits we think are actual. Say for thousands of years, flight was practically an actual limit, and most people lived as if it was an actual limit. And if the human subject needs limits to develop, then perhaps the inability to fly actually functioned as a limit that somehow helped subjects develop in a good way, actually. But then it turned out, with basically the Wright brothers, that flight was not an actual limit, it was a contingent limit. It was contingent on the invention of the airplane, right? And so it was always already a contingent limit, but for most of history, it was not realized as such. It was practically an actual limit, right? So the quality changed of flight once it was invented. And the argument would be, once flight is unveiled to be a contingent limit, then it can no longer function to develop the subject in the same way that it used to be when it was practically an actual limit. And therefore, for people to treat flight as a limit after the invention of the airplane will be different on their development than before. And it may actually not create complexity and merge the different things and so on and so forth. So you could say technology, here's the problem. Technology is removing as many actual limits as possible and unveiling them as contingent. But if humans need limits in order to develop, then it becomes harder and harder to find actual limits according to which they could develop. And maybe the actual limits you do find are so arbitrary and so inconsequential that they're not able to afford complexification. Like, I can't on the fly turn into a lizard. Okay, but it's arbitrary. It doesn't really bug me that I can't randomly turn into a lizard or something, right? But the inability to fly, that can affect logistical possibilities. It can, affect warfare. It can travel. The inability to fly can really be consequential. Whereas the inability to turn into a lizard randomly, or never to eat food maybe, or something, these actual limits are not consequential, right? You could argue, but maybe they are. We have to test them, right? But the point is that the technological essence can be seen as the orientation to unveil as many actual limits to actually be contingent limits as possible, right? And success means we no longer have limits necessary to develop the subject. But every time you unveil an actual limit to actually be a contingent limit, which I know is a funny thing to say, but then you get a productivity gain, you get GDP, and so on and so forth. But then, ironically, this would be the argument I would make: as productivity goes up and the GDP goes up, if the loss of limits negatively impacts the motivation of the subject, then that increase of GDP could then go down, because then people don't work as productively as they used to. They don't have the same motivation or incentive, even if they want to, and so it begins to fall. You get a massive creation of demand, like there's demand, but then it falls, right? And this is the kind of stagnation thesis and things like that. The only way to fix that is to regain essential limits, like limits that are actually consequential. And I think what those are excess limits, like limits where, like, conversation is an excess limit. There's always more to say, right? And when you organize and habituate people according to excess limits, those are very real limits. You never reach the end of beauty. You never reach the end of philosophy. You never reach the end of friendship. There's a real limit, but it's like a mystery for Flannery O'Connor. The more you discover, the more you find there's more to discover, right? So it's kind of a moving limit. It's a limit where there's always more to be unveiled, right? That, in my argument, would be our age is increasingly one where we're being pushed to find excess limits as subjects, because the actual limits that are of a quality for our development are being removed by the technological essence. They're harder and harder to find. And they can feel increasingly arbitrary and not valuable. Like for many people, going to space, yes, space is an actual limit. It's not by chance that space, because that's an actual limit, but for many people that feels like it's not really a valuable limit to overcome. It's not going to open a lot of doors, but there are many people who disagree. So you run the test. The market runs the test to see. But definitely what I would say is that the system, capitalism, as it makes limits contingent, if it does not provide a sufficient number of quote unquote actual limits to replace the limits it's overcome, then human beings don't flourish. They go crazy. They're psychologically overwhelmed. There's freedom, but there's freedom from, freedom to, but not freedom in. So they're destroyed by freedom. You know, people talk about, like many of the post-liberals were saying, when humans have no limits, then the stomach prevails over the mind, right? Like we devour ourselves, and we talk about autocannibalism, and there's a lot of truth to this. But what ends up happening is if you correct that by just someone forcing a limit upon everyone for their own good, well, now we have a dictator. So what I would like to argue is the social coordination mechanism is trying to replace the limits that technology has made contingent with excess limits, like beauty, like society, like friendship, like community. These are excess limits. You are limited from how much beauty you can handle at a time, but there's always more to be had. You're limited from the number of people you can meet or talk to at a time, but there's always more people to be had. And there's always more depths in relationship. Relationship is an excess limit. There's always new depths. Marriage is an excess limit. So the system is selecting for those because otherwise we go nuts. But then the question is, who has the limit portfolio or the culture by which they are best able to give themselves over to things like marriage or beauty or friendship or stuff like that, versus what portfolios are not so able to give themselves over to those things. I think the social community is an endless source of excess limits, but can you handle community? Or can you only handle community of people that are like you, right? Tribalism and so on. Now, $1 million bet, I mean, I'll throw it to you. There's way more. But so another question, if the environment, the global environment selects for energy, and I do think it basically selects for energy. You could argue it selects for value. And what value is a dialectic between ideas and energy, as we talk about in Belonging Again 2.1 with McCloskey and Vikhoff Smil together. But the point is, if it's selecting for value or energy or ideas or all those different things, then basically the question then becomes, is there, I'll just say energy, is there a quality and of energy that those who are able to handle global pluralism gets access to, that those who aren't able to handle them don't? Because you could argue if it's equal, if the energetic benefits of handling global pluralism are the same as something more isolationist, well, the trouble is so high with global pluralism, you just need to go in the isolationist direction. It wouldn't be worth it, right? So we also have to run the experiment to find out if actually the work of global pluralism gives you more energy than reestablishing the soul. It almost has to give you more energy than what isolationism gives you, or it wouldn't be worth it. And it's able to, say, generate creativity and ideas that couldn't happen. Now, I believe that's true. I believe history shows that greater diversity corresponds with greater energy, anti-fragility, creativity, and possibility. But it's harder. It's way, way harder. And the hardest of all possible diversities is that found in the interconnectivity of global pluralism. And we've just not had an age until now, basically, where that's really come upon us. And we've also not had, and I'll throw it back to you for any thoughts, and I know we don't have too much time, but we've also not had an infrastructure by which to effectively coordinate and experiment with different portfolios of limits to see which might be the best fitted for the interconnected environment. And the answer, and perhaps the answer is X between 2026 and 2028 for this part of America. Perhaps the answer is Y for this part of Europe between those years. We don't know. In the same way that the best hammer for Britain could be different from America at this time, or the best food or whatever, and it could be relative. You need this constant flow. You need this constant experimentation. You need this constant movement, you could say in a Deleuzian sense, but a constant movement of different limit portfolios and different recalibrations and different encounters and interactions, and just keep it going to see what energetically thrives and energetically does well, prevails, evolves in global pluralism, in the noon sphere. You know, people talk about the noon sphere. Well, the noon sphere is going to be a terror because you're going to be exposed to people's subconscious, people's desires. That's what Lacan and all these people are talking about. And you're going to be exposed to that. So who can handle that? Like, who can handle that without being energetically overwhelmed or put into a place where they just are, well, they're overwhelmed. And being overwhelmed, the qualities of being overwhelmed can look like, not being active, withdrawing from the social. It can look like not being creative. It can look like being angry all the time. It can look like not having children. It can look like all of these different things. But it would be evolutionary pressures. And I guess I really just want to stress that. The argument, it's not for us to decide. There's a way in which everyone has to make their, I want to say, bet. Everyone has to decide what portfolio of limits, ergo worldview, what worldview do you think, by its various qualities, metaphysics, beliefs, ethics, dogmas, whatever, what worldview do you think is best fitted to not be energetically depleted or overwhelmed by global interconnectivity? Or do you believe that no worldview can handle that, and you thus go for something more isolationist, or like, and now you really truly do need to be isolationist then. You do need to cut off more like the Amish or various communities, or do you buy that? Well, you have to make your investment. You have to make your choice. And I guess I want to say, many people have thought of the worldview question, and I don't want to sound overly utilitarian because I don't think utilitarianism has thought in terms of energetics. I mean, we're talking about an energetic thing. And yeah, it's Luke, Gurdjieff, all of that. I mean, there's a lot there in beauty and Holy Spirit and movement of the Spirit and so on. Like, we have often thought of the questions of worldview as, say, correspondence with truth, according to a correspondence of truth theory. What worldview is most true? Now, of course, the problem is we can't access the truth, and the map is not the territory. So even if you did have the map that corresponded with truth, you may not be able to know it. And then, of course, the great revelation of people like Peterson, and Hegel's talked about in his book on In Real Speculations, is that what Peterson and Pajot and those people, like in response to New Age atheism, is like, you must take desire seriously. You must take people's psychology. You must take the mind seriously. And there's something about religion and, you could say the symbolic world that is better addressing people's subconscious, their desires, and it's giving them something that they're not finding in a pure, objective view of reality, right? And so that's what they're turning to. Well, that could be very true, but that could also just fall back into old-time religious war dynamics if we're not careful. Now, that could be a caricature, but there's a lot more to say. But the point is, we have often thought of worldviews selecting for correspondence theory of truth. In an environment of global interconnectivity and globalization, you're going to have worldviews selected according to energetic anti-fragility. And that will be tested in the social. That will be tested in the encounter with the other person, unless you think you can survive without interconnectivity, like unless you think you can survive. But that means also you're going to have to cut yourself off from technology and Walmart. Like, being an isolationist doesn't mean you simply don't use the internet. It would literally mean you don't use Walmart, you don't use Amazon, you cut off from the globe. And maybe it's true. Maybe that's the best energetic strategy. But the system is, the world as an environment is testing for energetic anti-fragility. And the worldviews that will thrive are the ones that are able to, well, energetically thrive in that environment. And that will be something people, and then yes, there is self-delusion, and I know and yes, there is self-deception and all of that, but there's another way where energetics are hard to deceive yourself regarding. Like your energy is hard, like you can't self-deceive yourself into having a lot of energy if you do not. You can go take a cold shower and wake up, but like self-deception and energetics, there's something about energy and the shock of otherness that can be a better test of self-deception. But again, we have no guarantees. All we have is the constant testing. But yes, I'll give it to you. But the environment of the noon sphere, if you want to use that Chardin language, the environment of the noon sphere is testing for energetic fittedness of worldviews, and thus entire subjects, because there's no subject-object divide, like of energetics. There's something about energetics. And then do you think beauty increases energy? Do you think lack increases energy? Mystery? Do you think this combination of Hinduism plus psychoanalysis plus this exercise routine, and does that combination, it doesn't just have to be like one worldview, it's a combination of various qualities from very different things. Everyone will make their own portfolio, and the question will be, which is energetically most anti-fragility? And I think it's not just energetically robust, to use these Taleb terms, but energetically anti-fragile. You literally gain energy from the encounters with otherness and global pluralism. Like you gain from that. The system will select for that. And then, of course, the question then becomes, if you say, well, I don't want a worldview that is energetically anti-fragile if it's false, meaning it doesn't correspond with the truth. But then the question is, what other standard do you have to determine what is true versus that which increases energetics, energy? Like you say, well, it's because it corresponds with the facts. But one of the things we've all talked about is the map is not the territory. And certainly I would argue there would be reason to think that energetic anti-fragility is going to correspond with the case of how reality is. Because then you get into you get into Whitehead, creative, Deleuze, like what, it's not a question that we're not saying that truth does not matter, but energetics can be an indication of truth, or what I would call the absolute from that first conversation I had with Cadell, not just correspondence of facts, like energetics. Now, this is a larger topic, but let me throw it to you on any thoughts on anything.
Yeah, no, that's all good, Daniel. We're gonna have to wrap up, but I appreciate it, and that's really gold what you're getting at there, because also it speaks back to one of our other conversations on how it's not just merely about getting energy, because unfortunately people can get energy by breaking a plate because they're angry, and they're like, like I feel better. It's about the inner energy that you can cultivate spontaneous, like in a spontaneous, organic and mutual even way. That's important. It's not merely just I get, energy pellet from video game, or I get energy, not that, I'm just saying there's a lot of external things that can give you energy, but that's not sustainable. Well, it's just more fragile, like you said. If you want to get anti-fragile, then you're thinking about cultivating this inner energy that is, it just has the flavor that's more collaborative. It's more, like I said, it's more able to be generated in and of yourself, in and of the things you're able to attend to and control, in the sense of like you start to control your focus or attention in certain ways that allow for more energy. So yeah, that's important to mention as well. And I do think that, like you said, it's kind of undeniable if one has more energy or not. I think where the self-delusion comes in is when a person says, yeah, I know I don't have a lot of energy, but it's like I was saying before, the self-delusion can come in making that assessment and then deciding that it means that everybody else is to blame, right? Versus I might need to do something differently in my life. So that's where I think the self-delusion can come into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, then you really just have to be willing to ask some questions that may feel uncomfortable, but it's for the sake of like something very, very good for your own life and for those around you too. So I think that's all really, really important. And there's one more thing that was coming. Oh yeah, I just wanted to say too, even if you're like, yeah, this whole global pluralism thing's been it's been nice, it's been real, but I'm going to go back to my isolationism. The other thing is too, is it's challenging because, even if you basically want to be Amish, you really would have to do like a radical separation from the life you know now. And you may not find a community that would be open to receiving you. Not in most, I don't know, I think, I'm not sure exactly, but I'm pretty sure most isolated communities are usually closed. There might be one or a couple, I don't know, that I know of that are like open in the sense that they might receive a new person. But it's really like it's their family. It's their years and years of staying. No, we didn't want that. That's why we stuck with this. And I mean, I don't know that they would say it that way. They're probably pretty, kind of quiet and people who don't necessarily, they're going to be kind, but also not like, who knows? I'm not sure what an Amish person would say if you say, "Hey, can I join your community?" But what I mean to say is that even if you're like, okay, that's actually looking really appealing, I don't know how you necessarily find that. And so there's just this radical loneliness that I think people can also experience. And I think like loneliness will crop up anyway. That's kind of what it means, I think, to be grown up and like to be a person is like there's this having to push through that and find a way to feeling sometimes, but that it's not making my quality of life so bad. But anyway, I just think like there's something about, yeah, because I guess I was just thinking about that question of the Amish where even if you say, yeah, I'm going to actually just go and do the other one, because maybe, yeah, maybe it's better than, um, yeah, it may feel difficult to do that. It's almost like you broke a spider web light, right? Like you'll say, and then it's hard to get it to go back the way it was, but yeah, maybe you could. It's just that it's, yeah, you would also probably be having to forsake a lot of the things you already rely upon or utilize. And yeah, in terms of like the energy assessment there, I was also thinking that's interesting, right? Because could somebody in an isolated community say like they're like, I don't even care about, or I don't know, it's like their energy question. It would be an interesting one. I do think that. So basically, just the question of energy in the isolated community versus energy in the global pluralism. Maybe the one in the isolated community would be like, well, I'm not even thinking about that. At least I've got a community, right? But then again, you get people who feel stifled by those types of communities. So there is a real question there about the energy. And then also, I do err on your side where it does seem to be like, and it does feel very like Protestant in a way, which is funny because Amish actually are Protestant if we think about them as a example of an isolated group. But the Protestant seems to be like, no, we are in the world, not of the world, and we're kind of going to be able to engage with our different, with otherness in the sense of like we're not going to. Yeah, there's something there that does kind of feel Protestant in that sense, but that seems to maybe potentially be more of where the energy can be alive and be generated and generative. So yeah, that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, well, I think it's very true. It's not so easy to be isolationist. And I guess just to close, like if you're not even thinking about energy, that's a pretty good sign that you've got a good portfolio, because energy is like that doorknob you notice when it breaks, right? Not if so if you're not even thinking about energy, that can be a really good indication that your portfolio might be well situated and diversified or whatever to actually maintain energy given whatever environment you're in. Yeah, there's a way in which what is being suggested here is that to ask about worldviews, especially as the world is increasingly interconnected, it can be framed as asking a question: what do you think is the best anti-fragile energy portfolio in least contingent? And if you say, well, this one is really fine with energetics, and then the qualities of it being a good investment would be things like energy, creativity, your mind, it feels open, you can have self-forgetfulness often, you're able to interact with different kinds of people and handle it and not go crazy or overwhelmed with anxiety, quality of life in general in that way, not just because quality of life in a deeper sense, beauty, not just because you have money or something, could be very good indications. And if you kind of say, well, I think X is the best anti-fragile energy portfolio, as AEP for today, I suppose. Well, then how contingent is it? Is it contingent upon you playing video games? Well, then that's pretty weak, actually. Is it contingent upon you not encountering people who disagree with you? Then it's pretty weak, right? You should check your portfolio for contingency. How much contingency does it have? Because if it has a lot of contingency, then that would be a bad investment, because it depends on, like people will talk about an investment if you need the market to go up all the time, if you need the NASDAQ to go up all the time to make money, then that's a bad strategy. But if the NASDAQ can collapse and you make money nevertheless because you're also invested in commodities, or if the NASDAQ goes up and you still make money because you're well diversified, that would be a good portfolio because it sustains itself over time. Basically, there is something of that's kind of analogical, that there's something like that we have to think with energetics. And we have to think about the environment of global interconnectivity as selecting for energetics as such. And then the test that we need that is being run, which nobody knows the answer to, but I think there's good reason to think, is there something about global pluralism that, if you can handle, actually creates more energy than what is possible if you isolate from it and can't handle global pluralism? And yeah, I guess the other thing is, like, for me, a lot of the post-liberal stuff has a problem because if the post-liberal claim that we need limits is true, but without this testing mechanism, it almost has to mean, well, then everyone becomes Catholic, or everyone becomes Islamic. Everyone joins a worldview that has limits, and that could be energetically better than the neoliberalism of which makes everything flat before AI calls her, but also it's basically just a matter of time before culture wars come back, or conflicts between different religions, because you haven't dealt with the problem of difference. You've only recovered energy. You've brought back an old address, and that's going to you're going to be stuck in the cycles of history then. Like, you have to find an energetic strategy that is able to handle pluralism, not simply indirectly suggest that pluralism needs to be overcome. Because if you say everyone needs to be a Catholic or something, you are saying that pluralism is a reality of the world, but what we need to basically do is overcome it. And no one may say that directly, but that would be basically the direction it would have to go in, that would inevitably bring about trouble, as opposed to basically having pluralism potentially generate energy that is not generated from the lack of pluralism. And then the competition can be in terms of beauty that people can experience in the encounter of the other, as opposed to making everyone convert to their ideas, the kind of like a competition of beauty and shine. But that is in the encounter of difference and the girdle point and incompleteness, right? So it has a judgment of joy that comes to it. But that's all other things. Always good to talk to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Always great too, babe. Thanks so much. Talk to you later.